Welcome to another edition of the Big News Roundup. I'm Bill Thomas, and here's what's happening right now. Federal agents arrest disgraced journalist Don Lemon and charge the loudmouth troublemaker for his leading role in the recent anti-ICE protest inside a Minneapolis church. A U.S. senator claims that by actively stoking resistance to federal authorities, it was actually Governor Tim Walz who symbolically pulled the trigger of the weapon that killed protester Alex Preddy. And a Florida nurse gives up his license to practice after refusing to provide anesthesia to patients who identify as MAGA. Also, a federal judge issues a critical ruling in the case against alleged killer Luigi Mangione, and fans worldwide are deeply concerned after TV host Ryan Seacrest takes his latest spin on the legendary game show Wheel of Fortune. And we're going to solve that puzzle. All of this and a whole bunch more, it's coming up right now on the Big Roundup. We have a great deal to get to today, and we begin with this. The long arm of the law has finally caught up to journalist Don Lemon after the brash and irritating instigator. He recently embedded himself with an unruly anti-ICE crew that stormed and then completely disrupted a Minneapolis area church service. Now, to refresh your memory, the troubling incident took place a couple of Sundays ago when, accompanied by Lemon, a mob of dozens of out-of-control protesters actually stormed a house of worship called the City's Church in St. Paul. As many Americans have undoubtedly prayed for, at long last, federal agents right here in my hometown in L.A., they arrested Lemon and temporarily took him into custody for his role in allegedly coordinating the attack, locking him up overnight and forcing him to spend a number of hours in jail before he was eventually released following his arraignment. According to officials with the Department of Homeland Security, among other things, Lemon has now been charged with conspiracy to deprive rights and interfering with First Amendment rights for his part in allegedly orchestrating the disturbance. And if he's convicted on those charges alone, Lemon could be staring at more than a decade behind bars. In the meantime, Lemon's attorney confirms that federal agents finally caught up to his dodgy client in Hollywood, where he was preparing to cover the upcoming Grammy Awards. They still have the Grammy Awards? I wonder if Lionel Richie is up for anything this year. He also claims that at the time of the church disturbance, Lemon was legitimately working as a journalist, that he was simply doing his job to shine light on the truth and hold powerful people accountable for their actions, and that most of all, his efforts are in fact all constitutionally protected by the First Amendment. Additionally, he promises that his controversial client intends to vigorously and thoroughly fight all the charges against him till the bitter end. In case you don't know who this clown is, the 59-year-old Lemon spent years as the host of his own primetime opinion show on CNN, need we say more, before eventually getting canned a few years ago for some very questionable behavior. And that's putting it mildly. Yeah, it's a family program. Got to be careful. For his part, regarding the recent church fiasco, Lemon denies being in league with the demonstrators at all, despite mountains of evidence to the contrary. He claims he was merely chronicling the event as a reporter, eventually posting video of himself alongside his alleged co-conspirators before, during, and after that takeover. Final thought, and this is the News Roundup Lowdown, and here's how it all pans out. As Don Lemon fella, he's no different from that train wreck of a Congresswoman Ilhan Omar, and at the end of the day, they're both in search of nothing more than a heaping helping of attention. Look at me, notice me, I'm ready for my close-up, and all that other goofy jazz. And just to recap, you'll recall Omar holding a town hall meeting earlier this week when she was allegedly attacked by a guy in the room who poured some apple cider vinegar on her. Yeah, like you, I'm amazed she survived unscathed. And of course, mission accomplished. She's famous again. But not for fraud or becoming an overnight multi-zillionaire, but for being a victim. Poor kid. Hey, same thing for this Don Lemon guy, who at one time had an actual paying job over at CNN. Now, no idea what CNN stands for. If you know, leave us a comment. I think it stands for Crybaby News Network. Yeah, they hire a bunch of liberal little boys and girls to whine about how horrible Republicans are and how cruel the world is. In any event, CNN, the Crybaby News Network, actually fired this guy a few years back, so he's got to find a way to stay relevant. And to do that, he reportedly took part in a church disruption earlier this month in Minnesota, and that's why he spent a bit of time in the clink. Now, full disclosure, Mr. Lemon claims he was working as a journalist when this happened. His lawyers claim he deserves a free pass, and perhaps he walks away from the fiasco with all charges dropped. You know, more important, regardless of the outcome, people are talking about him, which makes him relevant again. And I say, well played, Don Lemon. Turning now to a stunning accusation from a prominent U.S. senator who says that any way you slice it or dice it, both Minnesota Governor Tim Walz and his lackey, Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey, they're the ones directly responsible for the tragic death of fallen protester Alex Preddy, and that furthermore, they actually did it on purpose, according to him. Senator Tommy Tuberville of Alabama says that even though federal agents fired the fatal shots that killed Preddy, it's the state and local leaders in Minnesota who created the conditions on the ground that led to the deadly confrontation by constantly flaming the flames of unrest. Goes on to say that although a federal agent actually fired the weapon that shot the agitator, at the end of the day, the people who really pulled the trigger that day are both Walz and Frey. Additionally, Tuberville claims that both the governor and the mayor are completely at fault for what's going on right now in Minneapolis because they intentionally encourage radical protesters to resist federal authorities, all in order to distract people from their multi-billion-dollar fraud scandal. In a nutshell, he argues that both Walz and Frey were caught red-handed stealing the taxpayers blind, so they whipped demonstrators into a lather and got them to do their dirty work for them by flooding the streets, jumping on cars, and fighting back against ICE operations at every turn. Furthermore, Tuberville, he's a bright guy, also accuses Democratic officials and their media allies of distorting the situation entirely. Says that contrary to what they would have you believe, most Americans overwhelmingly support our country's federal immigration enforcement efforts, that Minneapolis is the rare exception, and that both Walz and Frey, they should be investigated immediately for continuously putting ICE agents in harm's way. In the meantime, both the governor and the mayor spinning like a broken record and whistling the same old tune. For his part, Mayor Frey claims that having thousands of federal agents in Minneapolis is making his city less safe. That's not true. He also calls their deployment an invasion of our democracy. Also untrue. He also says he's made it crystal clear to anyone who will listen that ICE operations need to end immediately, both in his city and nationwide. And he is kind of one backwards thinking individual, the way I see it anyway. Final thoughts, and this is the News Roundup Lowdown. Now, here's the bottom line. Everything happening in Minnesota, and more accurately in Minneapolis, it's a bit of a shell game. Now, the shell games they play at those low-rent carnivals, they're workable. And worst-case scenario, you lose a buck or two against a minimum-wage ex-con working the booth who's trying to earn enough dough to buy a corn dog and a root beer when his shift is over. Now, the Minneapolis shell game has a much higher price tag. The carnival barkers, the carnies in charge, they're playing for much higher stakes. Communities are being destroyed and lives are being lost. The carnies, as the gentleman from Alabama accurately points out, are a couple of ill-intentioned politicians. We call them the tag team of Walz and Frey, and there they are. Not sure why I left out Ilhan Omar because she's kind of in that neighborhood as well, but apparently this time she gets a bit of a free pass. Now, all along, you've heard Governor Timmy and Mayor Frey Cook blaming the Trump administration and federal law enforcement agents for the tragic deaths in Minneapolis. But the blame is misplaced. Seems to me that all the instigating, that is, which Walz, Frey, and their lieutenants participated in, encouraging people to fight back against lawful law enforcement activity to put themselves in harm's way. It was all designed to generate chaos, violence, lawlessness, and more, and the consequences are catastrophic. It is nothing more than a despicable shell game. They distract you by telling you to fight, interfere, riot, attack law enforcement officials. And the worse it gets, the better it gets. Yeah, check it out. While everyone's focused on the chaos in the streets, their minds are distracted from the billions and billions of dollars worth of fraud, illegal immigrants committing crimes, and more. They try to present themselves as both heroes and at the same time victims while vilifying the Trump administration for simply attempting to restore law and order. Fine work, Walz and Frey. Locals are clearly suckered by your shell game, but the rest of the country, they're on to your disgusting and deadly scam. Switch things up just a bit now. Take a look at a former medical professional in the Sunshine State who's making headlines, but for all the wrong reasons. According to reports, a Florida nurse has just chosen to give up his license to practice after publicly refusing to administer anesthesia to patients who are aligned with the MAGA movement. In a now detailed social media post, the former registered nurse, his name is Eric Martindale, proudly declared that moving forward, he would no longer perform anesthesia for any surgeries or procedures involving loyal MAGA patriots. Goes on to say that his refusal to treat MAGA patients is his absolute right as a private business owner, part of his solemn ethical oath as well, and that in the end he can refuse to give treatment to anyone he chooses. Additionally, Nurse Martindale also claims that his social media profile was mysteriously hacked. Really? But that seems to be more of an excuse other than a reality. Because by all accounts, he voluntarily gave up his nursing gig in Florida and then quickly skipped town, bailed out to move to Indiana. We're on to you, son. So, Florida's Attorney General furious about the entire matter, and he basically says, good riddance to bad rubbish. I agree. Goes on to say that his state has zero tolerance for radical partisans who prioritize politics over their ethical duty to treat patients with both respect and dignity, and that healthcare should never be contingent upon an individual's political beliefs. Final thought, and this is the News Roundup Lowdown. This is a very peculiar story, and one which prompted me to do a great deal of very deep research. In the past several hours alone, I've read literally dozens of books, and I've learned everything I can about medical patients. Yeah, I'm kind of a quick read. Turns out there are male and female, short and tall, thin and portly, happy and sad medical patients. There are wealthy and poor, famous and obscure, black and white, young and old medical patients. Yeah, they come in all shapes and sizes and colors. It's amazing. So, since 5:30 this morning, I've also consulted with 92 different hospitals all over the country. I've interviewed hundreds, maybe thousands, maybe tens of thousands of doctors, also surgeons, hospital administrators, and even a couple of orderlies for good measure. At the end of my exhaustive research, my findings are going to blow your mind. And here's what I found out. Turns out in the history of medicine, there has never been even one reported case of something described as a MAGA patient. They don't exist. In other words, medicine and politics, they're mutually exclusive. Who knew? Turns out surgeons can operate on virtually anybody, and a person's political affiliation never has any impact on the procedure. Every nurse in the world also agrees with my findings, which means this nurse Eric Martindale genius is now only the second nurse in the world to ever receive the prestigious News Roundup Nurse Ratchet Award. Editor Pranov, a round of applause, please, for the fine nurse. That's very well deserved. Now, you recall Nurse Ratchet from the Jack Nicholson movie One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, and she looks a bit like this. Kind of a frightening old girl, isn't she? They called her a cold-hearted, passive-aggressive abuser exercising near absolute power over a patient's access to medications. If the shoe fits. Not the kind of girl you bring home to mom. Hey, Editor Pranov, the one we call Pranov the Magnificent. Let's do it. Let's take a look at that trophy right now, right over my shoulder. And I just thought about this because it is such a big honor. I say we go rogue. The weekend is here. Let's go full screen and show the whole world that beautiful trophy. It is just gorgeous. A good job, Nurse Martindale. You are a real credit to your profession. Well done. We'll change course now and focus on an alarming report which claims that a major backer of our nation's widespread anti-ICE protest movement has direct links to the Chinese Communist Party. That's bad news. According to the report, a former American tech mogul who now lives in China has been providing large chunks of cash to a number of radical far-left organizations which are currently mobilizing thousands of agitators throughout the entire U.S., including, right there in Minneapolis. Goes on to say that the extremely wealthy donor has been facing federal investigations for decades, that he moved to China to protect himself from American authorities, and that he's fighting back the only way he knows how, by using his secretive dark money networks to intentionally wreak havoc right here on U.S. soil. Even worse, he's repeatedly been connected directly to the CCP, with one report claiming that he's already dropped $500 million to finance a variety of different extremist groups that share his own twisted and radical pro-China ideology. Now, a couple of additional headlines we are keeping a very close watch on here in the News Roundup newsroom. Hey, man, you want to be informed as the weekend approaches, don't you? Come on. First up, in a surprising turn of events, a federal judge dropping a key murder charge and ruling that accused killer Luigi Mangione will no longer face the death penalty for allegedly shooting and taking the life of a United Healthcare CEO. That happened, you'll recall, in 2024. And meanwhile, authorities have just arrested a 36-year-old Minnesota man after he allegedly showed up at a New York federal jail and tried to spring Mangione by claiming he was an FBI agent and on official business. And moving along to several breaking developments on the international front. And to begin, Secretary of War Pete Hegseth is urging Iran to quickly abandon their nuclear ambitions, warning the Islamic Republic that President Trump is in fact a man of his word and that the rapidly approaching U.S. military armada will soon be in position to fulfill his command. Also in the Middle East, Israel announcing plans to soon reopen the pedestrian border crossing between Egypt and the Gaza Strip as President Trump's ceasefire plan for the area takes another significant step forward. Well done. And in Europe, at the request of 47 himself, both Russia and Ukraine have agreed to temporarily halt a number of critical airstrikes against each other as frigid winter temperatures continue to blanket that entire region. Now, a quick gander at a bit of showbiz news, and we kick things off today with a growing concern for a legendary TV game show host. According to reports, 51-year-old Wheel of Fortune guru Ryan Seacrest now looking so gaunt and emaciated that fans across the globe are genuinely worried about his health. Among their comments that the American Idol host is so skinny that he's now being played by another actor altogether, that the person standing on the stage is not really him at all, and that in a best-case scenario, he's aging poorly right before our eyes. Well, ain't none of us getting any younger. In fact, I'm pushing 30-ish. Dude, have some grub. You're looking a bit thin. By the way, Pranav the Magnificent, put up the number 4 platter if you would. That's the one with the enchiladas and the tacos, the beans, the rice, tortillas. Have something to eat. By the way, it is a good reminder that in life you can host any program you want, unless Ryan Seacrest wants it as well, in which case you're kind of out of luck. This guy is everywhere. I think they call that term ubiquitous. He hosted the New Year's Eve Rockin' Eve program. He's got American Idol, Wheel of Fortune, also Celebrity Wheel of Fortune. And I'll say I've heard him say this literally hundreds and hundreds of times. He always says his career will not be complete until he has a chance to guest host. Right here on the Big News Roundup, he always says that. And I always tell Ryan Seacrest, get some more experience under your belt, son, and in time, we might give you a shot. Slow and steady, work your way up. Also in Hollywood, America's favorite 1980s action movie hero now heading back to a movie screen near you, whether you like it or not. But the tough guy who made him famous in the first place simply won't be along for the ride. Yeah, he wasn't invited. Production on a prequel to the 1982 classic First Blood now underway in Thailand. And the new flick is an origin story called John Rambo. Stars an up-and-coming actor named Noah, I hope I get the name right, Centineo, in the iconic lead role. And believe it or not, Sylvester Stallone has nothing to do with the latest version at all. How'd that happen? You know, sequels, prequels, and all the rest, they're pretty okay, I suppose. You ride the Matterhorn at Disneyland, you get off, get right back in line, ride it again. You read a good book. After short spells, some folks like to revisit the old readable. However, at this point, all of us know more about John Rambo than we ever wanted or needed to know. And they've already made 5 Rambo pictures, so enough's enough. Come on, Hollywood, get creative. I say find a new topic, take a chance, and create some art. And with that, it's time for us to call it a wrap on the Big News Roundup. Have an awesome day. Have a terrific weekend as well. Stay safe. And if you haven't done so already, I hope you have. But if you haven't, hit that subscribe button right over there. Don't forget. With that, we're going to dim lights, going to fade to black very gently. And we'll see you back here next time for another edition of the Big News Roundup.